husband returns from the dead. In the dimly lit room, the soft glow of candlelight danced along the walls, casting eerie shadows that seemed to reach out and beckon. The air was heavy with anticipation, as though the very atmosphere itself was holding its breath. The table was set for two, adorned with fine china and crystal glasses, a feast fit for a king. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the meal was meant for my husband James. I had been waiting for him to return home for hours, growing more anxious with each passing minute. He was never one to be late, and the unease that had settled in my gut began to gnaw at me. My thoughts were a whirlwind of worry, the images of a car crash playing like a haunting movie reel in my mind. Just as I was about to dial his number once again, there came a heavy knock on the door. My heart skipped a beat as I rushed to open it. A uniformed policeman stood before me, his face a mask of solemnity. "Are you Mrs. Elizabeth Turner?" he asked gently, his voice carrying an undercurrent of sadness. My throat tightened as I nodded, a sense of foreboding settling over me like a suffocating shroud. The officer's words were a punch to the gut, a wave of disbelief crashing over me. "I'm sorry, ma'am. There's been an accident. Your husband, James Turner, was involved in a car crash on his way home. He didn't make it." A scream caught in my throat, trapped by the weight of shock and grief. Tears welled up in my eyes as I struggled to comprehend the words that had just shattered my world. I felt my knees give way, and the officer's strong arms caught me, guiding me to a chair. Time seemed to stand still as the officer offered his condolences, his voice a distant echo. But as the shock began to wane, a chilling realization crept over me. I turned my head, my gaze locking onto the dining table, where a plate was now empty. My husband's seat was untouched, the food I had lovingly prepared now untouched, growing cold. Yet there he was, James, sitting at the table, a sinister grin spreading across his lips. The officer followed my gaze, confusion clouding his features as he looked back at me. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" I turned back to the officer, my breath hitching in my throat as I pointed at James. "He's right there. He's eating. He's alive." The officer's brow furrowed as he exchanged a puzzled glance between me and the empty seat. "Ma'am, I don't see anyone there." My heart raced as I turned back to the table, my eyes widening in disbelief. James was still there, his grin widening to an unsettling degree, his eyes boring into mine with a malevolent intensity. Panic surged through me as I realized that the officer couldn't see him, that I was trapped in some twisted nightmare. As the officer continued to speak, his words became a distant buzz in my ears. I stumbled to my feet, my gaze locked on James. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and unnatural. My breath hitched as he took a step toward me, his eyes never leaving mine. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing in as though they were alive. "Ma'am, are you all right?" The officer's voice was growing frantic, his hand reaching for his radio. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from James, my body frozen in terror. He reached out a hand, his fingers inches from my face, his touch icy and clammy. I could see the glistening sheen of sweat on his forehead, his skin pale and sickly. And then, in an instant, James was gone. The room fell silent, the only sound the pounding of my own heart. I turned to the officer, my voice a hoarse whisper. He was here. I swear, he was right here. The officer exchanged a concerned glance with his partner, who had arrived at some point during my trance. "Ma'am, perhaps you're in shock. We should get you some medical attention." But I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. The room seemed to darken as a bone-chilling wind swept through, extinguishing the candles, and leaving a trail of goosebumps in its wake. I clutched at my chest, a feeling of dread settling in the pit of my stomach. As the officers led me outside, my gaze lingered on the now empty dining room. I knew, deep down, that James was gone, but the memory of his grin, his presence, would haunt me forever. The line between the living and the dead had been blurred, a veil lifted to reveal a terrifying truth. And as I looked back one last time, I couldn't help but wonder what other horrors lurked just beyond the threshold of our world, waiting to send shivers down the spine of anyone unfortunate enough to cross their path.